Let's talk about power. In this case, I am referring to social power, not electric power. Power, in the context of a society, can also take form of political power, civic power, and some other forms. But again, in this course, we will talk about social power in general. So, in general, power can be defined as the ability to influence, or control the behavior of people. That implies that power is a prerequisite of influence. That's why it is so crucial to understand it. Because this is what leaders, and managers in general do all the time. They achieve organizational goals by influencing people, the team. You might think, hold on a second. I do influence people around me all the time, like, my wife, my friends, my followers on Instagram, but I don't have no power. Well, no. If this is what you think, then you are wrong. If you influence anybody, then you do have power, by definition. It's just that the power can reside in so many different things. Sometimes social power is purely emotional. For example, people want to be influenced by you, because they are somehow emotionally dependent on you. So, you have power. Sometimes, just because you know something better than your colleagues, your expertise, you have power to influence others. In broad sense, power can be understood as a flip side of dependency. I mean, power and dependency are inseparable. In any given relationship, say, between a leader and a team, a parent and a child, power on the one side exists only as long as dependency exists on the other side. The question is, where does the dependency, and therefore the power, come from? I will tell you about that in a few moments. Talking about where power comes from, or, what is power based on? The best of existing frameworks on this issue, is the framework of 5 sources of power, suggested by social psychologists John French, and Bertram Raven back in 1959. According to this framework, any power has to be based on one or several sources, among the following 5. First is the ability to coerce. Coercive power relies on threat, or force, and is aiming to achieve compliance, or obedience. Second is legitimacy. Legitimacy in this case, is another word for formal authority. Third is reward power. This power is based on ability to offer, or deny, a reward, tangible or intangible. Fourth, expert power. This power is underpinned by knowledge, experience, skill, and so on, that allows an expert to solve problems for the others. Finally, fifth, is the referent power. Referent power is based on voluntary affiliation. People submit to the holder of this kind of power voluntarily, driven by sympathy, admiration, prestige, and so on. Next, I will go through each of these bases of power in detail. But before I do that, let me first clarify some basic terminology related to the concept of power. And also, I should explain the criteria, on which I will assess each of the power types. So, to recap. First, power is always present in any social relationship, because power is based on dependency. Our society functions only as long as we are mutually dependent. So, power is just everywhere, even in families. Second, power is a prerequisite of influence. You may use power to influence others, or may not. But influence requires power. A power holder, the one who influences, is called agent of influence. The one who is being influenced is called a subject of influence. To understand how power is used, how it should be, and should not be used, it is useful to focus on 3 characteristics of the power bases. First is voluntariness. This is the extent to which the effect of influence is voluntary. If it is not voluntary, it is forced, coerced. Between voluntary and involuntary you have indifferent. Second is the importance of surveillance. This is about control over the effect of influence. For example, do we need to watch and provide feedback to the subjects of influence for the power to be effective? Finally, a very important characteristic, is stability of a power base. Stability here means how reliable a given power base is, what is the chance that it will be taken from you, that it will erode with time, or will simply deplete, like money, for example. Let's start with the analysis of the coercive power base. An ability to use force, or the threat of force, can only be used to enforce obedience or compliance with certain norms. For example, coercive power may be used to make people do something, for example, work for free, or not do something, for example, not share a secret information. But you cannot use coercive power to inspire and motivate, you cannot use it to lead, to persuade, change attitude, and so on. Any influence that is based on coercive power is highly involuntary. An extreme example of coercive power is slavery, or prisoners' labor. These are very special cases, but it doesn't mean that coercive power does not exist in office buildings. Blackmailing, bullying and harassment, this is what coercive power can be in work context. As a result of high involuntariness, this power can be effective only when a system of surveillance is effective too. That means that the one who relies on coercion is obliged to constantly control the subjects of influence and penalize defiance. Force is a very primitive power base. And it is highly stable too. That is because once you got this power, it is relatively easy to maintain it. But coercive power is not all bad. It really depends on the way it is exercised. For example, it can also be used to protect. For example, to protect society from dangerous elements, or to protect people from potentially harmful circumstances. This is what law enforcement is for. Or, parents often exercise coercive power with their little children. But whatever is the cause, the effect of this kind of power is still highly involuntary, develops frustration and resentment, and requires surveillance. Legitimacy is a complex power base. In fact, when we say legitimacy, we mean several different things. First, legitimacy as a base of power means formal authority. For example, a police officer, due to his position, has a formal authority, therefore he or she can legitimately require that you, for example, show your identity card, or open the trunk of your car. You might not want to do that, but you feel obliged to, as long as you know that the request is legitimate. Power in this case is vested in the position of the officer, and underpinned by formal norms, that is national laws. In the office, a boss has legitimate power to promote subordinates, change employees' functions, lay off, as long as these actions do not contradict legislation, such as labor code, or penal code, and the organization's internal policies. Second, legitimacy can be informal. This base of power is underpinned by informal norms, such as norms of ethics, social expectations. For example, you have power in respect of somebody who owes you a favor. The social norm of reciprocity obliges the person who owes you a favor to pay back the favor. Therefore, it is in your legitimate power to demand something. There are also ethical norms of fairness and equity that oblige people to compensate for effort, distribute benefits fairly, and so on. There are plenty of other social norms and expectations that somehow define responsibility, and therefore can be used as a base of power. For example, you may emphasize your seniority and commitment to the organization when you ask your boss for a favor. The boss will feel obliged to fulfill your demand, as long as your demand is perceived as legitimate. So, legitimacy as a power base is used to achieve compliance through social conformance. In other words, feeling of responsibility, willingness to conform, need to belong to society in general, or need to belong to a group, fear of social condemnation, fear to damage reputation, and so on. This is what makes this power base effective. In terms of voluntariness, the influence based on legitimacy is either neutral, that is neither voluntary nor involuntary. That means that people perform what's expected from them, and perceive it as just normal. Or, it is negative, when subjects resent against authority, disagree with the demand, question legitimacy. Importance of surveillance is rather high. But not as high as in the case of coercive power. Nevertheless, both formal norms, and informal norms, require social control to be effective. If there is no audience, nobody to condemn, no risk for reputation, or no risk of penalty, people are less likely to submit to authority. On the other hand, social norms, both formal and informal, are pretty stable. So is legitimacy as a base of power. Next goes reward power. Reward power is used to motivate for action. Not force, not oblige, but to motivate. Specifically, what is motivating in this case, is the expectancy of a reward. You may offer a reward for accepting the influence, or you may withhold a reward for not accepting an influence. For instance, you can promise a bonus for good performance, in this case you use positive reward power. Or, you may deprive an employee of a bonus, a pay raise, or promotion, in case of unsatisfactory performance. In this case you use negative reward power. Reward can be tangible, such as money, or intangible and symbolic, such as a symbolic prize, recognition, empowerment, attention, or whatever a subject of influence perceives as a valuable reward. You wouldn't need to rely on reward, if what you wanted people to do they would do voluntarily. So, voluntariness in this case is rarely positive. It is mostly neutral, or negative. If a reward is something very important to the subject of influence, if it is vital, such as money needed to support family, or protection, the subject may accept the influence in exchange of the reward, even if he or she would never do that otherwise. For example, in certain situations, let's say in bad economic conditions, vulnerable categories of people accept harsh and unfair work conditions in exchange for a reward, exactly because of extreme dependency, because of powerlessness. So, reward power in certain situations is hardly distinguishable from coercive power. As a result of limited voluntariness, reward power often requires surveillance. Stability of reward power is moderate, although it depends on the type of reward and the degree of voluntariness. Stability of reward power is limited because rewards, both tangible and intangible, have a tendency to lose value with time. Second, rewards, especially those that are tangible, tend to get scarce and eventually deplete. You have limited amount of budget that you can use to pay bonuses. You cannot promote the same person more than once or twice a year. You may empower an employee with responsibilities once, but you cannot empower the same employee infinitely. Expert power is based on power holders' knowledge, skills, and access to information. It is used to convince people to act in a certain way. Expert power is particularly effective when the subjects of influence are driven by a need to achieve. In other words, expertise is usually needed as an input to some process. Let's say, a consultant's advice may be needed to make a strategic decision. So, the consultant has power to influence the decision-makers, because the decision-makers need to achieve some goals. Obviously, expert power is stronger if the expertise is rare, hard to find, difficult to substitute. Expert power is effective in situations that involve a lot of uncertainty, when the problem is novel and complex. Let's take a situation of a natural disaster as an example. Such situations are always sudden and novel, they involve a lot of uncertainty. What to do, what is going to happen next, and so on. Individuals or groups who are perceived to have expertise in such situations will gain power. For example, firefighters, or military. Same rule applies to companies. For instance, in crisis times, those who have experience with crisis management will suddenly gain power. Expert power often comes not from deep knowledge in one domain, but from some knowledge in many different domains. Such scattered knowledge allows leaders to coordinate work of followers, organize processes. For example, a chief operations officer in a company may have more expert power than a CEO, exactly because he or she knows more about what other people in the company are doing. Expert power can be genuine, but can also be based solely on impression. I mean, individuals may possess expert power even if they in fact don't have the knowledge that they claim to have. It is important to understand that expert power is used to convince, and people are convinced when they trust. So, expert power is effective via trust. That's why, expert power may be based on symbols of expertise, rather than the expertise itself. Education, certificates, recommendations, appearance, all this may be used to gain expert power. Expert power has neutral or positive voluntariness. People accept experts' influence either out of trust and necessity, or out of trust and respect. Surveillance is usually not an issue. Expert power has limited stability, especially when it is not genuine, but based on impression. The reason is that knowledge, once shared, becomes a common good, knowledge tends to become obsolete, and audiences tend to learn. Finally, the referent power. Referent power is based on the subject of influence's need for affiliation, or identification, with the agent of influence. When people want to be accepted by a group, let's say by a football team fan club, they are motivated to align their behavior and even attitudes with the group. Or, when people want to be identified with an individual, for example a political or business leader, they are motivated to become more alike to that individual in their actions and even beliefs. In such cases, people are subjected to referent power. Referent power can be based on individuals' charisma, honorable achievements, positive image, reputation, distinctive and attractive identity, and so on. Not only individuals, but also groups and organizations may have referent power. Consumer brands, employer brands, communities of fans, celebrities, prominent politicians and sportsmen and women, all these often have referent power. The particular psychology behind this need for affiliation is highly individual. I would refrain from trying to list all of the motives. It can be admiration or even love, need for esteem, status, prestige, all these things together, and so on. Voluntariness of referent power influence is very high. As a result, there is no need for surveillance at all. On the other hand, referent power is very unstable. This power base is highly contingent on the audience's attention and emotions, but also on the power holder's actions. A brand might simply go out of fashion. A single mistake may destroy a reputation that took decades to build. So, let's summarize all what we just learned. There are 5 bases of power, according to the framework suggested by John French and Bertram Raven. These bases are coercive, legitimacy, reward, expert, and referent. There are 2 important characteristics of power bases: voluntariness and stability. I don't mention the need for surveillance here, because need for surveillance is almost perfectly inverse of voluntariness. Coercive power is very stable, but highly involuntary. Legitimacy is rather involuntary and rather stable. Reward power is relatively voluntary, but its stability is limited. Expert power is mostly voluntary, or at least not involuntary, but its stability is very limited. Finally, referent power is perfectly voluntary, but also very unstable. You can clearly see a pattern here. The more subtle dependency is, and the more voluntary the influence is, the less stable power base is. This suggests a conclusion. Different power bases have their limitations. There is a trade-off between power base stability and voluntariness. Moreover, as a leader you will need to exert influence on diverse audiences. Let's say your team may have people driven by status, others will be driven by need for affiliations, some will trust you, others won't, some will recognize your expertise, others will doubt it. As a leader, you will need to exercise power in different situations, for different purpose. Sometimes, you will need to exert influence in order to change audiences' attitudes and beliefs, convince them. Other times, you will need to mobilize your team for action, sometimes controversy action. Often, power is needed to simply make people accept norms of behavior, no matter if they like it or not. And so on. This is why it is important to understand power. An influential leader should rely on a good mix of power bases, and use them responsibly. This will help a leader to achieve effective total influence on audiences, and sustainability to exert influence in a long term. Now you understand what power is, and why it is important for leaders. After watching this video, take a quiz on the 5 power bases, then do the mini case exercise. Have fun!